Hi everyone, welcome back to DFTW, a channel to see the world from a different perspective. Please subscribe to our channel and receive notifications for our daily uploads. Today, we discuss Nvidia in China, and see how a tech war became absurd theater, and what it really means. If we step back and look at how the US-China tech conflict has unfolded, especially around Nvidia's AI chips, it almost feels like performance art. Not the kind we can immediately see as absurd, but one that leaves us scratching our heads and saying, wait. Is this actually happening? There's drama, irony, screwy rules, and unintended consequences that no one quite expected. And the central character in this story is Nvidia's H200 AI chip, which should have been a huge commercial win but instead became a geopolitical gateway drug, a policy ping-pong ball, and arguably, a marketing victory for China's own semiconductor ambitions. So how did we get here? Let's start with the US side. For years, US officials have been worried about China getting access to cutting-edge artificial intelligence hardware. The idea was that powerful chips, especially server-grade AI processors like Nvidia's H100 or H200, could be used to train huge AI models, and that if China got enough of them, it could leap ahead in AI development, including in military or surveillance applications. So the US imposed export controls, rules saying advanced chips can't be sent to China unless the company gets a special license. These restrictions didn't just drop overnight, they grew over time. By 2025, Nvidia needed government approval to send Beijing even the H200, a slightly less powerful AI chip, specifically castrated for China. The Commerce Department said this was because otherwise China could use these chips in supercomputers that might have implications for US national security. That hit Nvidia's results hard. The company publicly warned that such restrictions could cut billions off its revenue from China, and executives said the policy was clearly wrong because it would hurt both US business and global innovation. But then, in late 2025 and early 2026, things took a weird turn. US loosens controls, but with strings attached. In December 2025, President Trump announced that the US would allow Nvidia to export its H200 chips to approved commercial customers in China. That was a big deal because the H200 is far more powerful than the H200, and companies in China were starving for that level of computing power. However, this wasn't a free pass. The new policy had several odd conditions. Nvidia must submit export applications on a case-by-case basis, no blanket approvals. Chips could only be sold to customers who took strong security measures and promised not to use them for military or intelligence programs. Exports could not surpass 50% of Nvidia's US domestic customer demand. Before they were shipped to China, chips might be tested in third-party labs in the US to verify their capabilities, rather than being shipped directly from Taiwan. And in some versions of the deal, a significant fee, 25% of the chip revenue, would go to the US government as an export charge. In other words, the export door wasn't shut, but it was very narrow, very watched, and came with paperwork and fees that made everyone squint. If we try to explain this to someone outside tech, it's like saying, yes, you can buy this powerful tool, but only after proving exactly how you'll use it, paying a surcharge, and letting our people inspect it. It means those chips could even be modified or castrated, and the so-called third party might implant backdoors before shipping them. Chinese companies placed massive orders for H200 chips before the new rules, reportedly enough to total hundreds of billions of dollars worth of chips on paper. But once the new conditions landed, something strange happened on China's side. Instead of rushing to finalize orders under the US framework, Chinese customs agents were told by authorities that H200 chips were not permitted to enter China, even though the US government had technically approved the export. In practical terms, that meant shipments were blocked at the border, and suppliers, including companies in China that assemble AI servers, began halting production because they couldn't get the chips they had planned on using. In other words, the US said, okay, you can sell these chips to China after we do something in the United States. And China said, nope, don't bring those things here. Even Nvidia's leadership ended up traveling to Shanghai in early 2026, not to celebrate billion-dollar sales, but to navigate regulatory uncertainty and meet customers amid confusing signals from Beijing. Why would China do that? It sounds counterintuitive at first. Why reject chips that companies desperately asked for? There are a few reasons that analysts and insiders point to. First, national security and control. China has learned from decades of tech pressure that relying on foreign suppliers for critical infrastructure can be a vulnerability. If Nvidia's chips are monitored, taxed, or cut off due to US policy shifts, that creates strategic risk. That is especially true for core AI workloads that affect national tech independence. Second, industrial strategy. Blocking or slowing imports gives Chinese domestic alternatives more room to grow. Companies like Huawei, with its Ascend series, and other local AI chip makers are ramping production fast. Some data suggests that China is already using and improving its own chips at scale. That is part of Beijing's plan to reduce dependence on US tech and even dominate some segments in the future. Third, political leverage. Even if the Chinese government doesn't formally ban H200 permanently, restrictions can serve as a bargaining chip in broader trade or tech negotiations with Washington. Still, there are mixed signals from within China. Some reports also mention that while official policy adds barriers, there have also been quiet internal meetings with Alibaba, Tencent, and ByteDance about their demand for these chips. So the situation isn't black and white, it's strategic and complicated. In short, China has its own incentives that don't necessarily align with simple corporate demand. And in this case, those incentives outweigh enthusiasm for buying more US chips. The absurdity isn't just bureaucracy, it's economics. Let's talk numbers for a second, because that is where the absurdity becomes painfully clear. Earlier in the story, Chinese tech giants had placed potential orders totaling around $60 billion for H200 chips. That's massive. But under the new US framework, they'd have to pay full price upfront, as well as a large extra fee to the US government. Moreover, they need to undergo strict licensing and security checks, and wait potentially months, or even years for deliveries while the export, testing, and approval process plays out. When you add all that up, the effective cost and hassle turn a commercially attractive product into an unattractive one. So companies that could have bought advanced chips easily turned around and said, essentially, no thanks. That's just too expensive, too awkward, and too risky. We even saw hundreds of billions in planned orders get cancelled within a day or two. Corporate leaders didn't just pause decisions, they pulled the plug. That's an extraordinary reaction to policy conditions. The message from China's tech CFOs was clear. We can pay for technology. We can even pay for limitations. But we absolutely will not pay for insulting bureaucracy. What happens next? China's counterpunch was immediate. That isn't just a story of rejection. China didn't simply say no and walk away. Beijing's responses have been more structured and intentional. For example, in the face of US export restrictions, China has imposed high anti-dumping tariffs on certain imports, especially in related semiconductors, hitting imported polysilicon with rates far above normal levels. That's a precise way to pressure foreign suppliers while supporting domestic production. At the same time, regulators have revisited security review processes for imported AI technologies, raising the possibility that China could use its own laws to limit certain categories of foreign tech entering its market. That shows China is ready to respond not just economically but also legally to external pressure. In this light, the situation isn't just a rural market argument about chip delivery, it's part of China's broader strategy to assert control over its semiconductor ecosystem. Meanwhile, China's domestic alternatives spring to life. Here's the real twist. One of the things the US export controls claimed they would do was slow China's AI progress by choking off access to top chips. Instead, the opposite is happening. When H200 shipments became complicated, Chinese companies began looking more closely at homegrown options. Firms like Huawei and others were already developing powerful chips, and with foreign options constrained, domestic chips suddenly became practical rather than a backup plan. Analysts say it has sharply increased Chinese AI chip utilization rates, and in some cases, Chinese alternatives cost significantly less than the heavily regulated imports. For many workloads, especially non-bleeding edge AI training, those domestic chips are good enough and much easier to buy. Chinese companies find it's easier and cheaper to use homegrown chips than deal with opaque export rules. In economic terms, the policy intended to limit China's access to powerful AI processors may have accelerated China's self-reliance. That's a classic unintended consequence. All this makes the whole episode feel absurd on the surface, like bureaucratic performance art. But it's symptomatic of a deeper shift. The world's two largest economies are no longer just competing in markets. They're competing over control of technology supply chains. And they're using regulations, tariffs, and industrial policy as tools just as powerful as traditional free markets. From Washington's perspective, export controls are supposed to protect national security and prevent sensitive hardware from strengthening an adversary's AI and defense capabilities. From Beijing's perspective, importing technology on strict terms makes China vulnerable. They'd rather develop domestic alternatives, even if it costs more in the short term. And from the perspective of companies like Nvidia, it's the worst of all worlds. It lost market share in one of the biggest AI markets, stuck in the political crossfire between governments. And it faced supply chain disruptions due to both complex export controls and import blocks. Is there a real resolution in sight, then? That's still unclear. In the US, lawmakers are debating new rules to give Congress greater authority over AI chip exports, including reviews, and the potential to veto future shipments. That suggests export policy could get even more tangled. In China, there's a careful balancing act. They want advanced AI tools for commercial growth, but they're also determined not to let critical infrastructure remain dependent on foreign suppliers or subject to foreign political pressure. So for now, the Nvidia H200 saga stands as a case study in how geopolitics, economics, and technology intersect, often in chaotic, surreal ways that no one planner intended. It's not just about silicon anymore. It's about trust, independence, and who gets to call the shots in tomorrow's digital world. And if we step back and think about it, that's not performance art. That's policy theater with real consequences. Thanks for watching videos from DFTW. If they deserve more attention, please like and share them with your friends, so we can grow the community together to 1 million subs shortly.